Hi, folks. This evening for this GoTo session, which is DFM120, digital image making, I wanted to have a conversation that's a little off the beaten path. It is, or rather, I was inspired to have this discussion with you as a result of some of your discussions from week 2. Now I know it's week 3 and we're focusing on Photoshop activities, but as a sort of a rebuttal to week 2's discussion, I kind of wanted to have an extended exchange with you relative to the concept of ethics in content creation and what the short-term, long-term ramifications of Photoshop or Illustrator have on our content, on the work that we're doing. And the discussion post really centered on the ethics of retouching photographs. You guys watched some video pertaining to fashion content and the retouching of models and their physicality and their particular character traits, skin, hair, blemishes, so forth. And the majority of you were taking. I think the activity sort of channels us into a particular direction in terms of the point of the videos, and that was to question the ethics of retouching photographs in print media for the sake of selling beauty products or clothing products or any number of things that that we use physical models for. And you all came to very logical and predictable conclusions about that sort of thing. I think the majority of you took the position that it's unethical for obvious reasons to project images of the human form in conditions of optimal rendering, perfect figures, perfect skin, flawless skin, perfect hair, and so forth, perfect body proportion. And the obvious reasons are, of course, we don't want to inflict false projections on consumers or mislead them into belief systems that distort their views of normalcy. Should we put it that way? We don't want people to start believing that the objectification of the human form has now become an ideal that we all have to aspire to. And I think that's fair. It certainly comes into play with issues of health and nutrition, bulimia, and so forth. And I think that it also affects our issues of self-perception, self-confidence, and or self-value. And all of those are absolutely fair statements. There are absolutely fair conclusions to draw from that sort of a conversation. But I wanted to have a different sort of a conversation. I wanted to broaden the topic a little bit and talk about the subjectivity of photography itself, the subjectivity of content creation. And whether we as creators have the ability to create content that sees the world in an objective point of view. In other words, a point of view where we don't insert any of our own personal bias into what we are documenting or rendering. Is that even possible? And I think that it is, but I think that situations like that are extremely rare, because I think the whole motivation behind creating visual content is to support a narrative. It's to tell a story of one kind or another, whether that story is breaking news at 11 about the car crash down the street or the fire downtown, or whether it's, you know, a film that we're going to see at the theater, or whether it's an ad for yogurt or a car. There's always going to be a motivation for us to impose a little bit of our underlying motive into our content. If for no other reason than we're telling you our point of view. This is the car that I like. This is the yogurt that I think is the best. These are the clothes that I think you should wear, or the story I think you should tell your kids when you tuck them in at night. All of these are points of view, and points of view are extremely important in terms of creating content. Not too long ago, this is kind of a timely conversation, by the way, because not too long ago I wrote a paper called, or aptly titled, Is the Camera Capable of Objectivity? So objectivity is the all-seeing eye on the outside looking in at what's happening, and subjectivity is we are the eye and we are immersed in what's happening in front of us. And how do we feel about it, and what do we choose to see? How do we choose to record the events as they unfold in front of us, as opposed to being high, wide, and objective in the corner and seeing everything and making no value assessment of what's going on at all, and leaving all of that up to the viewer to decide. That's a really hard situation to put a content creator in, because invariably the whole reason we're creating this content is to achieve a goal of either selling a narrative, selling a product, or selling an idea. So thus the article about whether or not the camera is even capable of true objectivity. One of my favorite books is a photo sort of montage of Northern California. It's by a photographer named Steve Crouch, and one of his quotes, one of my favorite quotes, is from the introduction of the book called Steinbeck Country. And in Steinbeck Country, Steve is discussing some of these qualities of subjectivity in terms of the camera, and what kinds of stories are we trying to tell? What do we hope to achieve with our photography in terms of the stories that we're telling? So the quote reads as follows: I would emphasize that the mechanical equipment used to make any photograph is the least important link in the chain of events that is a photograph. The pieces of crucial equipment are the eye behind the camera, the brain that evaluates what the eye sees, and then says yes or no. And I think in that quote is the essence of subjective photography. We see an event, or we see a vista in front of us, we react to it, it stirs us in some way, and then our desire is to, in that moment, impart the feelings of that experience, the qualia of that experience to our readers or our viewership, whoever that may be. So that is that's our task. That's what we're doing. So does then the camera tell the truth? Or does it simply tell my point of view or your point of view of what we see? The camera, I go on to write that the camera is an inanimate device. It's a tool of intention. Like a personal computer or any other electronic device, a camera serves at the discretion of the one who wields it. Think about that. I mean, your camera sits on the shelf until you pick it up and go take pictures with it. That camera's not going to take pictures on its own, and it's not going to take pictures that it wants to take, and it's not going to take objective pictures of the world. It's only going to take pictures when you pick it up, and it's only going to take pictures in the direction that you point it and focus on the subjects that you select as worthy of the photograph in the first place. By definition, that's subjectivity. So it's an interesting point. The effects of the device are impracticable without the will of the operator. Impossible, in other words, without the will of the operator. So therefore, the will of the operator becomes extremely important. As a result, the integrity of the photographer is thrust to the center of ethical discourse. His renderings, like the product of his narration, are subject to evaluation on the grounds of integrity and truth. So that's really important, because that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about when we talk about, is it right or not for photographers to manipulate photographically the images of these models, and is it okay for the companies that they are working for then use those images to project standards or goals for their consumers. Is it right to do that? I think as consumers, we owe ourselves a debt of responsibility to be aware of the conditions with which we are being marketed to. In other words, we're all someone's consumer of something, and we are constantly under pressure from a variety of sources to listen to, understand, accept, and then act upon narratives that are all around us. Buy this gas, shop at this grocery store, drink this soft drink, smoke these cigarettes, you know. I think the Rolling Stones said it best in the 70s, talking about commercialism. A man can't be a man if he doesn't smoke the same cigarettes as me. We've been subject to this sort of pressure for quite a while now. It has brought about the birth of hyper-consumerism in this country, and it has shaped the way we present content material, how we use it for marketing, how we affect the opinions and the behaviors of the consumer base. And this is also by association the very essence of the study of rhetoric in popular culture. And that is, how do we use language, symbology, how do we use this new powerful digital content that we create? How do we use that to affect change, to influence groups, and to call those groups to action, to do something? Vote, buy, eat, take a vacation. What are we doing? And how much of that responsibility do we assume as content creators? And the interesting thing is, I mean, in the course of the content business, I mean, at many points in time, the the job of institutions like the FCC or the AFL-CIO, or the financial institutions like the Securities and Exchange Commission, for instance. All of these bodies have been created over time to help us mitigate the implications of ethical behavior in content creation and how we represent ourselves, our products, or our ideas to the general public. And we can find examples all through history. This is not just a recent thing, by the way. In fact, we can find examples of, rhetorical manipulation, should we say, of the subjectivity of artistic rendering in the in the age of classical art, for instance. The artist Caravaggio, who we know this individual, and if you take my lighting classes, you may remember references to Caravaggio as one of the classical enlightened painters who's known most for his work with chiaroscuro, the extreme contrast and the deepness of shadows and the presence or absence of detail in the light or the shadow of an image, representing dichotomy of health, sanity, conflict, physical or mental. And so Caravaggio was very much at the center of attention because of his skills at rendering with oil on canvas. And the funny thing about most of Caravaggio's prominent subjects, unless he was asked specifically, commissioned specifically to paint a visage of someone of importance, more often than not, the face that Caravaggio rendered on the body of the subject of his painting was his own. So how's that for, turning the concept of painting something on its head? He's painting something that he sees, but then he's projecting his own persona onto what he's rendering and somehow finding himself in his work. Or Jan Vermeer, for that matter. Jan Vermeer was a painter in the late 1600s. Here's one of his works. This is, I think, the geographer. And the funny thing about Jan Vermeer is you'll notice that this room and this bureau and this window and this, oftentimes, table are present in a variety of works by Vermeer, because this was one of the rooms of his studio, and he used this room frequently to render his characters. So the geographer was done in this room, the maid with milk was done in this room, the music lesson was done in this room, the cartographer was done in this room, a number, I believe the girl with a lute was also done in this room. So all these different subjects, but somehow miraculously all rendered in the same room. Now, the reason he did it, of course, is because he got this amazing quality of window light, which was coming in, this north light. And, I mean, it did a beautiful job of rendering his subjects in 3 dimensions and had a wonderful tonality and a beautiful fall off and a very subtle contrast, capable of deep shadows and fine detail all within the same piece of work. So, obviously he preferred to work in this room, but nevertheless, it turns out that the majority of the characters that he painted were all painted in the same room. So these are examples from, 17th century Europe that are showing you that even in those times with those artistic media, we were still choosing a point of view of what we were rendering and how we were presenting it to an audience. If we move forward in time and we start talking about the age of photography, when photography was in its infancy, um, it was used as a tool of propaganda in support of the effort to end the War of Secession in the United States, the Civil War. Most people regarded the Civil War as a sideshow that was only going to last a couple of weeks, and they all went and had picnics and witnessed the battle of, oh gosh, was it Bull Run? Something along those lines, where everybody sort of gathered and it became a very grisly affair, and everyone looked at the number of dead and realized that this was no Sunday picnic. This was actually a serious political discourse that had deteriorated to the point where people were dying now. So this is a shot here by a very popular photographer from that era named Matthew Brady, and he was noted for taking these grisly pictures of dead soldiers. This one is a soldier killed in the Battle of Antietam, a particularly bloody and costly conflict between the North and the South. And he was even rumored at times to stage his subjects in such a way that he got the maximum drama out of what he was photographing. Not just photographing dead soldiers on the ground, but manipulating them in such a way to draw the most amount of reaction and ire from the people that were looking at the newspapers that he was publishing in. So here's an example right here of a photographer from, this is 1862, more or less, circa 1862. And he's already manipulating the positioning and the rhetorical act of a dead soldier on the ground at Antietam. Is that ethical? I don't know. If you're doing it for the purpose of stopping a war, maybe there's an end that justifies the means, or maybe not. In the current media landscape, this is the sort of thing that can get you blacklisted from the journalism industry, because we no longer tolerate a situation where a photographer can manipulate anything in front of his lens, because all events that happen historically and globally are subject to the interpretations of the people that are most closely affected by those situations. So a guy like Matthew Brady wouldn't last long in the current photojournalistic environment. But he was a pioneer in those days. In those days, his job was to sell papers, and those papers' job was to inform a relatively uninformed American public about the seriousness and the reality of the War of Secession. Moving on, we have great examples of Arthur Fellig, best known by the moniker Ouija, who took photographs in New York in the late 30s and early to mid 40s. He was big in the world of organized crime, and his MO was he wandered around town in his car with a police scanner, and listened for when the police were responding to calls of gunplay, serious violence, and gang-related violence and killings in New York City. And this guy would follow him around, and he would take some pretty grisly images of, you probably can't see this very well, but some pretty grisly images of guys buttoned up on the floors of restaurants and subways and city, sidewalks in front of notable public gathering spots. And his motivation was to show the rawest and most laid bare images of the violent results of organized crime in the boroughs of New York City, and what was going on, and how the public needed to be aware that these guys were playing hardball. that they weren't fooling around, and that law enforcement had their hands full with a bunch of guys who were capable of some pretty nasty stuff. As far as we know, Ouija was never guilty of manipulating his subjects or positioning them in any way. But there is a fellow, a character in the movie The Road to Perdition, which you may have seen, starring Tom Hanks, and he's a gangster on the run with his son, and he finally is caught up to by the hitman who poses as a gang-slaying photographer like Ouija. And as he shoots Tom Hanks at the end of the movie, as Tom Hanks is slowly dying, and he pulls out his speed graphic 4x5 camera, sets it up on the tripod, and he's going to take a picture of Tom Hanks. And he goes and he adjusts him a little bit, and he fixes him for the photo, and then he goes back and he snaps the image. And that's an example of how these folks would sometimes take liberty with the content that they were creating. Fast forward to the era of the Second World War. This is a pretty famous photograph from history. We know that this is the Marines planting the flag of victory on Mount Suribachi in the Pacific Campaign as part of the towards the end of the Pacific Campaign of the Second World War. And this photograph was used liberally to raise money for war bonds and to create, to generate propaganda in favor of the American war effort in Europe and in the Pacific. But not a lot of people know that this was actually take two of this image, that the first image used a different flag that was all tattered and torn, and a different set of guys who really were in no mood to pose for a photograph because they had just been in a fairly intense conflict and they had won this hill through blood and effort, and they weren't really interested in having their photographs taken, so it wasn't really a very presentable composition. And one of the officers on site at the time realized that this was a propaganda opportunity and restaged this photograph for the photographer Joe Rosenthal for the newspapers back home to generate sympathy and support for the American war effort in the Pacific. This was actually a staged image that has become part of the American lexicon. Here's another famous image of John Kennedy at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. John Kennedy, as most of you will know if you've done any research, served in World War II on a PT boat in the Pacific, and suffered injuries to his lower back and extremities as a result of constantly being in this boat and conducting war activities on the water in less than ideal conditions. And he had a real bad problem with back spasms. Well, on this particular day in the Oval Office, in the midst of dealing with Khrushchev and the missiles being staged in Cuba, President Kennedy had a back spasm, one of his relatively bad ones. And so to relieve himself, he turned and he leaned on the credenza behind the desk in the Oval Office to try and relieve some of the pressure on his lower back. But the White House photographer at the time, George Thames, saw this moment and captured it. And from George's point of view, it was President John Kennedy struggling with the ethics and the morality of fighting communism in a increasingly hostile world of the 60s, and the pressure that he was experiencing in the situation with Khrushchev in Cuba caused him a great deal of stress. And so the title of this photograph was published as Tormented Burden, and the reality was it was just a back spasm. But this is what I'm talking about. These are narratives that we elect to support or that we choose to ignore or reevaluate with our own personal experience and our own perspective on issues of subjectivity. From one of my great books on rhetoric and civic engagement, Catherine Palzewski states that metaphors are ubiquitous and inconspicuous at the same time. They populate language, yet few people are aware of their presence. Metaphors' stealth nature is part of the power and the structure of rhetoric and rhetorical thought. So in other words, these metaphors, these photographic subjectivities are they're all around us. They're working on us constantly, and they are sneaky in their nature and how they get into our subconscious, and they help us form perspectives and opinions on issues all the time. The CNN anchor David Burnett, producer from CNN, had a really great quote that I included in this paper, and that was that a picture is simply a moment. And although we might think that we can divine what it is we're looking at, there are times when a visual representation of life is simply neither the whole truth nor nothing but the truth. So, in other words, truth has a great deal to do with your point of view, who's telling the story. And it also does not necessarily consist of the entire message. So it's about what our point of view is. And when we choose to point our camera in a particular direction, what are we trying to say? What message are we trying to convey? And are we using the medium to manipulate and to control outcomes? Or are we using the medium simply to document what has happened in an objective point of view? An objective point of view sells nothing to anyone. The subjective point of view is always driven by a narrative. And most of the time, I think that's what we're dealing with our images. So think about that. It does place a lot of the burden of ethics and responsibility on the photographer or graphic artist or painter or producer of content. But there are no more institutions that will guide us and restrict us or regulate us in terms of what we say, when we say it, and where we say it, and with what medium we use to address our audiences. So we have to, at some point, we have to start making decisions, making choices, and choosing sides. What side of an issue do I want to be on? What side of a narrative do I want to be on? What do I like? What do I not want to promote? What do I want to reflect in my work? And what do I choose not to see? In other words, the power of the camera resides greatly in the direction that we point it. Keep that in mind. See if you can apply that to some of the questions of retouching and Photoshop and Illustrator, and see if this makes any sense. I'd be very interested in hearing some of your feedback if you have any. And let me know how you feel about this issue. Some of you have been really great on the discussion posts. I try to ask questions, and hopefully you respond to those questions and let me know what your point of view is on these matters. It makes a great deal of difference, I think, sometimes in how we pursue our career if we know what our direction is, what our motivation is, who our audience is, and how best to address those audiences, and what those audiences are concerned about. We're not just out there randomly creating content. We're creating content for somebody, and the person we're creating it for has got a position, an opinion, and some form of desire. And those are the folks that we serve, the audiences that we address. So let me know what you think. Be very interested in hearing your comments. Other than that, thanks a lot for checking out this video, and I'll talk to you again soon.